Hello, this is Professor JPS, and this is Communication Arts 154. This is a lecture on April 1st, 2020 for tomorrow's regularly scheduled class, April 2nd, Thursdays from 1 to 4:15. This evening I'm discussing what we left off with last week with the film Ctzn Ruth and the writing chapter, aspects of the writing chapter, which is chapter 9. And I want to get into the text and context of the film Ctzn Ruth to give you guys a sense of what I think is most important about that film and how the writers, Alexander Payne and Jim Taylor, utilized some of the aspects that we learned about last week of motif, symbol, and metaphor. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the next chapter on the syllabus that deals with story and primarily nonfiction film, which is just a fancy way of saying documentary film. Okay, so I hope you all are staying safe and making sure that you're washing your hands as much as possible and staying home. Very, very important. Take it very, very seriously. Anyway, it's my hope that you all got a chance to see the film Ctzn Ruth. I can't believe it's already 24 years old. It's a film made in 1996, and it was the first film made by the filmmaker Alexander Payne. Alexander Payne is someone from Nebraska, and he made his way to Los Angeles and went to the American Film Institute, which is a prestigious place to go to make films after college. And he was a very interesting fellow and lived in Los Angeles for a number of years, but always returned to Omaha, Nebraska to make some of his more interesting films. He made this film. He made a film called Election. He made a film called The Descendants, which actually took place in Hawaii. And I wish he would work more often because I think he's a terrific movie maker. But anyway, back to the film Ctzn Ruth, which is a very rich film in a lot of ways, and there's a lot in it. But I want to describe this idea of context first with the film. Now, we have discussed context a little bit before in class. I just want to reemphasize what context means, or one of its many definitions. For our purposes here, context has to do with the idea of the political, economic, cultural, social, artistic aspects of any given time period. Context takes into account everything that's happening in the culture that affects, for our purposes in this class, affects films. And films are always made from the present. I mean, obviously, right? But what I mean by that is they reflect the current contexts of the time period they're made in, even if the film is about the past or the future. The movie makers are always commenting from the position of the present, whatever the present is. So the film is political in nature. I guess you gathered that. But for those of you who haven't quite seen it yet, just understand that it's relatively political in nature. The film is made in 1996. Now, 1996 in America was a reasonably happy time. There was an economic boom in the 1990s. It was primarily generated by the internet boom that was happening, and we were not at war, and it was pre 9/11. There was no major conflicts that the United States was having with other nations. It was a pretty uplifting, reasonably happy and safe and content time period. And often, when there's a kind of relatively content time period, both economically and foreign policy-wise, like no wars, the issue of legalized abortion tends to rise as a political issue, usually brought up by the conservative wing of America to battle against the liberal wing of America. When things aren't so great, abortion the debate goes back sort of down into the bottom of the list of things that people are battling about. Generally speaking, no one's talking about abortion right now with COVID-19. No one was really talking about abortion after 9/11. No one was talking about abortion after the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. So when this film was made, the abortion debate was a bit more prevalent, even though the political times were relatively safe and secure. That's one just area of context of the film. And just as a matter of course, I don't mean to insult your intelligence, but the United States legalized abortion nationally in 1973. So it really hasn't even been around. Well, I guess it's been around almost 50 years now. But ever since 1973, with the Roe versus Wade court case, where abortion was allowed by the Supreme Court as a right of privacy between a woman and her doctor, ever since that time, there's been a very, very strong battle between pro-life and pro-choice advocates, with a very, very strong institutional background on each side, where pro-life people are battling all of the time to say that abortion is immoral, and pro-choice people saying that it's not their business, it's up to the woman to make that choice between herself and her doctor to abort up until close to 3 months of pregnancy. That's been ongoing. Now, as I say, that debate usually rises a bit more in fairly safe political times, and then lowers when political times are a bit more difficult. This was one during that safe period of time. Okay. The thing about this film that makes it well written and interesting and somewhat palatable is that it's a satire. It's a satire. It's a comedy, essentially. Now, it's almost counterintuitive to think that you could have a comedy about the abortion debate, because it's such a serious issue on both sides of the argument. People really hold these particular viewpoints very close to their heart. But satire is an important reminder of how it is that we can see the weaknesses of arguments made, political arguments made. And real biting and interesting satire is, for the lack of a better definition, making fun of a serious issue in order to reveal that issue's weaknesses or failures, to show it before the world in a humorous way, to make people not only laugh, but to make them think. And at the core issue of this particular film is the abortion debate. But where it's a satire is that it takes both sides of the debate and makes fun of how each side, the institutions of each side, use Ruth as a political pawn, and don't quite care enough about Ruth as an individual, even though they're espousing individual freedoms on both sides. They're more interested in their cause than they are in Ruth. And I think that what gives the movie its strength is it doesn't necessarily come down on one side or the other of the argument between pro-life and pro-choice. It makes fun of the seriousness of the pro-lifers. It makes fun of the seriousness of the pro-choicers. And it shows how each side is really using Ruth as a political pawn in their game against the other side. As Ruth goes from side to side, she doesn't know who to trust until ultimately she tries to, in some ways, trust in herself. The way in which the film tries to make those jokes is to treat the issue relatively seriously, but at the same time, all of the other characters are playing their roles very straight. They're playing them with great earnestness. The baby savers singing those songs, the pro-choice people who are stereotypical lesbians who are singing at the moon. Each side is made fun of to show their willingness to use Ruth and not really care about her as an individual as much as they should. Okay? That's what gives the film its sort of satiric sensibility. It's making fun of institutions, the institutions of the pro-lifes and the institution of the pro-choicers, as interested in power and not interested in the individual they're supposed to be representing. Okay? So that's a little bit about the context of the film, the political, to some degree, social and economic aspects of the movie. In terms of some of the textual aspects of the film, that is to say, the mise en scène or the ingredients of filmmaking that help convey this sense of satire, I think the key idea with Ctzn Ruth visually is the way in which the compositions are used to demonstrate this notion of, quote, both sides. Okay? I mentioned this a little bit in last week's lecture, that there's a handful of times when Ruth is facing someone in authority, like a judge in the beginning of the film, or one of the leaders of the pro-choice movement, or one of the leaders of the pro-life movement, or the doctor she goes to see when she's thinking about getting an abortion, where the visual compositions are not unlike what I'm looking at right now, like straight on shots of the camera cut between Ruth and the person in authority, right? I was bad at geometry. I forget what that is. 90 degrees, 45 degrees, I don't know. But straight on shots like this, a shot of Ruth and then a shot of someone in authority right back at Ruth, cut back and forth to each other, where the viewer is then seen as you're saying one side, then the other, one side, then the other, one side, then the other. And that sort of works on the audience as a visual motif, a kind of reminder that this movie is about two sides, two sides, two sides. There's that part where Ruth is in the bathtub and she closes her left eye and closes her right eye. Every time she does that, she gets a different point of view. The point of view changes. It's a visual motif to demonstrate this idea of both sides. When she looks through that kaleidoscope, we get a point of view of the kaleidoscope, and you see all of these sides, a multiplicity of sides, right? There's some wonderful tracking shots on dollies, on wheels, of the protesters, pro-choice protesters, pro-life protesters, where the camera goes this way, showing all the protesters yelling, and then the next cut, the camera goes that way, right? And when you're watching the film, you're just thinking, okay, yeah, I get that visual rhythm. But what it's doing is it's sort of planting in the mind of the viewer this notion that the film is about competing sides. It's about both sides. It's about conflict. It's about this and that, okay? Even the shot where Ruth is in the front lawn of the women who are the pro-choice folks, the stereotypical lesbian couple, and they sing to the moon, goddess moon, and Ruth has no idea what's going on, and they hug her, and Ruth's head sticks out in between them, where the two women's back of the heads are here, and Ruth's head's here. So, and then they cut the other side of that, okay? This visual motif, this recurring motif that is part of the writing by Alexander Payne, who co-wrote the script with Jim Taylor, and it's obviously part of the visual composition of the film, to keep reminding the audience that there's two sides to these, two sides every single time. The key shot in the film that demonstrates this notion of two sides is after Ruth has what is a miscarriage. So she's no longer pregnant, but she doesn't want to tell anybody because she still wants to get that money and go pretend that she's having an abortion, right? And when she has that miscarriage, there's a shot of Ruth lying down on the bed from over top. It's almost like it's almost like from heaven above looking down on Ruth. And there's this wonderful move of the camera where Ruth's head is one way, and then it slides in a nice dissolve, and then her head is completely turned completely upside down visually. I mean, her head doesn't move, you know what I mean? The camera moves, and it's a dissolve going from one image to the other, where she's literally upside down in terms of where her headspace is. That demonstrates this clear path of this idea that she's then thought through both the baby savers and the pro-choice people And now she has to depend on herself to see what she's going to do to fool them all, because she's been used by both sides. She's been a pawn in their game. And that's a beautiful shot from, it's like an objective shot from above, looking down on Ruth, and her head spins one way and then the other. And it's a dissolve. It's not a hard cut, it's a dissolve. One image replaces the other image. And it's the perfect illustration of how there's no longer going to be both sides. It's up to Ruth. It's all in her head now, so to speak, okay? You see both sides of her head, so to speak. It's a beautiful shot. Another thing in terms of the textual analysis that gives this film, I think, a lot of its strength is its music. Not only its music, that is to say the songs, but the musical score. The musical score is really, really good. Let me first get to the songs. The songs themselves, for the most part, are used just completely ironically, the opposite of their intended use. The opening sequence is the most disgusting lovemaking sequence I think I've ever seen. I mean, it's just this filthy, low-life guy she's having joyless sex with this filthy, low-life guy in a dingy apartment, and looks like it hasn't been cleaned forever. They look like the two of them haven't been cleaned forever. It looks like, just kind of skeezy two junkies maybe having a sexual encounter. But the music is a very romantic song by Frank Sinatra, called "All the Way." Nobody loves you until someone loves you all the way. It's very romantic, right? But it's used in completely the opposite way in which what we see as a totally non-romantic scene. There's other songs in the film that tend to be, or musical moments in the film that tend to be used somewhat ironically. But the musical score, it's really sort of semi-hidden. You hear it, but you don't hear it. But it's there throughout the film, mainly to remind you, as you're bouncing around from Ruth's really strange, weird life, that the film is a comedy. Because the musical score is relatively lighthearted. It's sort of like it goes din 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 din. Now, I know that seems weird to hear me say this on the YouTube channel, but like if you remember, what that does for an audience is it cues the audience to make sure that they're more relaxed. We know this is about abortion. Is she going to abort the baby? Is she going to upset other people? Oh, don't worry. The music sort of just gently reminding me, the musical score that is gently reminding me that this movie is a comedy, that this is a comedy that we're going to have, that it's not going to be like a after-school special wrenching decision by Ruth. And some of the raunchy bits and the drug use and the sexual encounters and the way she like hits the little boy, it's all there to kind of shock the audience. But it's also there to kind of let the audience know that this film, while treating a serious subject, it's doing it in a funny, satiric, thought-provoking way, which is hard to do. And the reason I use this film for the writing chapter is because this film is very well written. Because of what I just said, it's hard to make a satiric comedy about something serious like that and heart-wrenching like that. And to do it and pull it off they're doing it by making sure they're presenting both sides of the issue to show that both sides are somewhat misguided. And they're more interested in the institutions that they're representing than the individual, Ruth. Okay? But that musical it's called a leitmotif, or repetition of a musical score. It's very, very lighthearted to gently remind the viewer it's a comedy. It's a comedy, okay? Another motif in this film that I think is quite compelling and interesting are the use of primary colors. Now, you probably have to look back again and see it, but most of the time when the film shows the color red, it represents a certain degree of danger. Red is often associated with danger or sometimes passion in works of art or even film or even theater or television or what have you. And in this film, usually when Ruth is in some sort of trouble or some sort of self-destruction idea, the color red is around. Like the huffing the paint can stuff is red. Big Red is named one of the new paint cans. When she's hiding right at the end of the film, she's up against a red car. There's other times in the film where red represents a certain degree of danger. The primary color blue, however, is generally associated in this film with a degree of safety and some security. Even when she's in a blue coverall in prison for the first time, she's come to rescued by the baby savers, who are all also dressed in blue. So with some frequency, the color blue is used to help remind the viewer of a degree of comfort or safety. Now, you don't need to be a genius to figure out that red and blue and then white are the colors of the American flag, and virtually everybody in the movie is white, and it's made in Nebraska. And I think that those two primary colors, along with the race of the character, is a kind of metaphor for America, right? The use of colors in the film is one of those metaphors. The use of both side visually is a kind of motif in the film. And I think those are very, very important ideas symbolically to guide the viewer along in the film. That really is a very interesting and compelling and funny movie. And it ends open-endedly. We don't know what's going to happen to Ruth. I always would ask my students what they think would happen to Ruth, whether she would blow that $15,000 right away and buy more paint cans or buy drugs, or whether she would actually get her life together. Maybe if you have your screening sheets, you can let me know what you think will happen to Ruth. But I think the key ideas have to do with this notion of the context of the political era allowed for the abortion debate to be satirized. Satire is something making fun of serious to reveal its weaknesses. And in here, they're satirizing the institutions of the baby savers and the pro-lifers. And the notion of both sides, visual composition of both sides, is very compelling and important, and it's a very well done motif by Taylor and Payne, Alexander Payne, the director and the writer. And the music is ironic, and the musical score is light to remind the viewer that it's a comedy. Okay, it's a very, very powerful and funny and thought-provoking film, and I think that we can learn from. And Alexander Payne's made some terrific movies since then. Made a terrific movie called Sideways, and Descendants Sideways, and a movie called Nebraska a few years ago. I wish, as I said, I wish he would work a little bit more frequently. He's a very fine filmmaker. Okay, so if you have questions, send them to me in an email. Write up your screening sheets. You can send in screening sheets. Just send them an attachment to me as an email, but send them to me. You can send them to me 2 at a time because my email box is just so full. But that's fine. If you want to do it 1 at a time, whatever. Just make sure you tell me who you are and what class you're in. In terms of what will be today's film and today's chapter, I mean, it's tomorrow, but it's this week's film. Oh, by the way, just a reminder, for the writing chapter for Ctzn Ruth, 387 through 395, 387 through 395. In terms of what I want to discuss for, we'll go backwards chapter-wise. It's chapter 8, it's story. Chapter 8, story. And on pages 342 to 348, Giannetti, the author of the textbook, discusses the idea of realist and formalistic narratives. Realistic and formalistic narratives. Those few pages are worth going over, those 5 or 6 pages. And again, with the pictorial explanations, I think are very, very good. Even if you haven't seen the film, you can get a sense of what they're talking about. And pages 342 through 348 describe realistic and formalistic narratives. And what they're really getting at is what we really visited first in chapter 1, with the difference between realism and expressionism/formalism. It's the same idea, it's just updated, and they give a few more examples, or he gives a few more examples in those pages. So I think it's worth just looking through it. You don't have to memorize it, but just look through it in terms of the idea of story, what story means. Much of the chapter that deals with fiction film, Hollywood films. But what this unit for me is interesting because this is the one film that I'm showing in this class that deals with documentary or non-narrative fiction. And the key ideas for non-narrative fiction are on pages 348 through 354. 348 through 354. Okay? And in there, I want to just talk a little bit about documentary and what is expected of documentary and what is different about documentary, and a very important part of documentary history that changed in the 1960s or so. Documentaries have been around just as long as fiction films have been around, but most of the films that have been made in America have been fiction films because they entertain us, and people want to see entertaining things, a version of reality, but not reality. And documentaries are supposed to be about the real world, but of course documentaries have to cut and edit and make choices and leave things out and put things in. So documentaries aren't necessarily the complete unvarnished truth either. And a movie maker could shoot all kinds of footage and not use half of it and use only the half he or she wanted to make a particular point. And they do. So you should always take documentaries with a grain of salt because they're always somebody's point of view. They're always somebody's opinion, always somebody's thoughts. Now, whether or not they're fair and if they're interesting, that's really the point of whether or not you think a documentary is worthy of something. Now, prior to changes in technologies in the 1960s, documentaries weren't made that much because it was just too difficult to have large bulking cameras and large audio machines to capture life without disturbing it. I mean, you couldn't just go into someone's apartment with a gigantic movie camera in 1920, 1930, 1940, because it would upset the actual reality you were trying to look fine. It's not like today when cameras are, size of a pin. A key change happens in 1960s with the change in technologies. And this is discussed on page 350 in the textbook. And there's 4 major changes that allow for a new way to do documentary. Now, it's not new to you or me, but it was certainly new in the 1960s and changed documentaries forever. And these 4 changes, it's right in the middle of page 350, but I'll go over them. One is a lightweight 16 millimeter camera, handheld camera. A lightweight 16 millimeter handheld camera that gave the movie maker or cinematographer a great deal of freedom to move around, which prior to lightweight, smaller cameras, you just couldn't do that. The cameras were huge. They were huge between 1895 and the 1960s, really. Okay, so that's number 1. That's number 1 change. Number 2 change is something called a flexible zoom lens, where you could zoom in on something and zoom back. That lens technology allowed for movie makers to capture something in the foreground very, very quickly and make it in focus. So number 2 is a flexible zoom lens. Okay. Number 3 are what's called faster film stocks. Faster film stocks. Now, this is not digital film. This is film. Film, like film strips that went through a camera and then went through a projector and light hit it and then went on a wall. Not like your iPhone camera, which you can do instantaneously. Technically, that's not film, that's digital technology. That's not quite the same thing. I mean, it's good, don't get me wrong, but what we're talking about is 60 some years ago. Faster film stock just meant that the film would not need as much light to actually be seen. Okay? Prior to faster film stocks, which is just the way you grade film, actual film, not digital film. Faster film stock means that you could shoot in low light and still see an image. Okay, so that was the third key change in documentary, or allowed documentaries to flourish in a different way. And the fourth was something called a portable tape recorder. The portable tape recorder was called a Nagra, N-A-G-R-A, Nagra, N-A-G-R-A, and it allowed for the tape recording guy, usually a guy, to tape the sound, and then when they put the sound and the image together, they could synchronize it. Again, this is not digital film where it's all done at once. This was film and sound spliced together in an editing room. Okay. Prior to that, you couldn't have a small miniature tape recorder to do that. the Nagra allowed two people, one guy to film and one guy to use the tape recorder, to make documentaries. Never happened before. Big turning point. Right around the early 1960s, some fiction filmmakers used that, but documentary really showed the way in a new era called cinema verite. It's a French phrase. Cinema verite, V-E-R-I-T-A with the apostrophe over the I-T-E, over the E. And that just means cinema truth. Cinema truth. So what this meant was now the filmmaker had great freedom to take his or her small camera and small tape recorder and go anywhere they wanted to document reality without the staginess of pretend Hollywood. Okay? It was called also fly on the wall documentary, wherein the filmmaker now was like a fly on the wall, capturing reality as much as possible. Now, of course, you can capture reality, but you still have to edit. You still have to choose a point of view. You still have to leave things out. You still have to focus in on some things and not focus in on others. So it's really up to the filmmaker's point of view. It's a cinema truth, but it's the truth of the filmmaker, and whether or not you find the filmmaker trustworthy is another issue. But there were some really compelling films made in the 1960s that were so different than Hollywood fluff, that were documentaries, okay, 60s and into the 70s. In fact, there's a Rolling Stones documentary called Gimme Shelter, where they capture a murder on film. One of the guys who was in the motorcycle gang called Hell's Angels, when they were working there as protection for the Rolling Stones during this concert in San Francisco at an Altamont Speedway, and some guy rushes the stage with a gun, and the Hell's Angels people, which is a motorcycle gang, they stabbed the guy right in the back of his neck and killed him right on camera. There's this magnificent film called Titicut Follies, which was outlawed in Massachusetts for some 35 years because the filmmaker, a guy called Fred Wiseman, got his camera, went into a state-run facility for the criminally insane, and he showed just how horrible the conditions were in there, because it was real life and it was so different than Hollywood fluff. And there were some interesting films by this wonderful movie maker called Barbara Koppel, where she made an outstanding film, one of my favorite films I've ever seen, called Harlan County, about a coal mining strike in a deep, deep, poor town in Kentucky, and just how horrible the people were treated there by the coal miner owners. And she was young. She was this young, nice, the stereotypical nice Jewish girl from New York who went, to culturally different Kentucky, and put her camera in the faces of real poor, hardworking coal miners, and the riot police squads who were firing guns right over their heads and over their cameras, and pushed her to the ground, all right on camera. Now, your generation, you grew up, and even your older brothers and sisters grew up with reality television. But reality television is only staged reality television. I mean, it's real, but it's not really real. It's sort of scripted to seem real, right? This was groundbreaking because they could take the cameras and go in and do all that stuff. And they could really try to get another sort of defined view of the world cinematically that was much different than Hollywood movies that were, entertaining and sometimes very, very good, but for the most part, so fictional, right? So there's a handful of wonderful examples of these cinema verite, or sometimes referred to as direct cinema films, over those pages, 351, 352, to about 354, 355, okay? And that's what I really want to concentrate on in this particular chapter, because the documentary, I hope you're able to see tomorrow or the next few days. It is available on Amazon, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon, so you'll save $1. It may be harder to find somewhere else. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure, but it's an outstanding documentary, and it's made by a guy called Earl Morris. And what it's about is, Earl Morris is a movie maker who goes to Texas, Dallas, Texas, to hear the story of a man on death row for a murder of a police officer. And what unfolds before the movie maker is this unbelievable set of circumstances that happened in the late 70s and early 80s that put an innocent man in jail. even though the institutions, the law, some judges, the police, they all have a sense that this guy could not possibly be the murderer, but it doesn't matter. And this movie, just based on the movie maker's investigation and the way in which he gets information after information, interview after interview, and how he stages his particular film, it was so compelling and so powerful and so sympathetic and above all so rational that this movie helped get this man, Randall Adams, the accused, out of prison. Now, I know you guys like those Avenger movies, and I know you like Batman, but if you have a documentary made from 30 years ago that actually gets a person out of prison in Texas, that's a pretty powerful statement for direct cinema, okay? Now, what I want you to watch for in this film is how this movie, even though it is in a tradition of cinema verite films, I want you to get a sense of how it differs in terms of cinema verite. How does this film actually challenge some of the tenets or conventions of cinema verite? Okay, because it's very, very interesting the way in which this film is shot for a documentary. In some ways, it's very stylized, differentiating itself from cinema verite films, but still building on the tradition of cinema verite. Okay, it's made in 1987. It's directed by Errol Morris. Pay attention to the musical score because it's really, really good. Pay attention to all of the ingredients that the documentarian uses visually, because it's not just a movie of people talking into the camera. There's newspaper clippings. There's video news reports. There's photographs. There's police file reports. And then there's these unbelievably interesting and stylized recreations of the crime itself. It's one of my favorite films because I think it does so many different things, and it's a very smart film. And it's an example, I think, a high example of nonfiction filmmaking in the latter part of the 20th century. And it differs from what it is that I just described to you about cinema verite. Okay, it really does. And part of your challenge, besides challenge actually get to see the film, is to see how that film differentiates itself from the supposed authorities of cinema verite that we discussed a couple minutes before. Because cinema verite is about truth. And this movie is about truth too. But how does this movie get to truth as different from some of the cinema verite films we discussed? Okay, that's your challenge, okay? So tomorrow is April 2nd. We would be meeting April 2nd tomorrow. This is the evening of April 1st. Just a gentle reminder in terms of the syllabus. This is our last film before an exam, which will be next week. So next week we will have a review and an exam. And what I'll do is I'll just email you the exam, which will be a little bit different from the last exam. And then you just email it back to me in I don't know how many days I'll give up, 2-3 days, 4 days to get it back. And then you just send it to me in an attachment. But I will review for the exam before next Thursday, like I would have in a normal test, okay? And so just keep that in mind. I want you to make sure you're following the syllabus and as much as possible. And email me any questions, okay? Email me any questions you have, and please make sure you're looking at your NCC email. That's really, really important. NCC email is real important because, I don't have everybody's personal email. I only have what the banner system allowed me to do. Also, I know you guys have a lot going on, and you're used to, you're not used to sticking around in your room and doing all your work on your computer. Neither am I, believe me. But it is worth mentioning that I'm available for advising for courses that you may need this summer and or this fall as communication arts advisor. Okay, so I think it's important that we remind ourselves that we do that we don't just put our heads in the sand. And I would encourage all of you to make sure that you know how to get your degree evaluation, whatever it is. Look at your degree evaluation, because I'm not going to be able to meet with you. I can probably do Zoom meetings one-on-one if you want to, but if you at least have your degree evaluation in front of you, and perhaps if you did that in a Zoom meeting, perhaps we could talk, or if you just have a sense of what courses you may be interested in taking. Right now, all of the courses are live, although for some reason, every communication arts class just says staff. I don't know why that is, but that'll be rectified soon. And for you journalism people out there, for the fall, we are teaching both media writing and what's that other one? Media writing and digital journalism. Now, digital journalism has not gone the past 3 times we've tried to do it, but we're going to try it again in the fall. And also, and I'll try to mention this from time to time, I am teaching a summer film course. It's ComArts 256, Focus on the Director. It runs from the late May to late June, and it's it's 10:30 to 1:15, Monday through Thursdays. And you see films most of that time, and you have 1 exam and 1 final and screening sheets. It's very much like this class. It's just compressed into 4 weeks, not even 4 weeks. And on Thursdays, I buy donuts or bagels or muffins, if you like. That is, of course, if we actually are going back to the classroom. But even if we aren't going back to the classroom, I will be teaching the summer film course. At least I'm offering it. So keep that in mind. Okay? Listen, guys, no kidding, man. The numbers in Norwalk are really, really high right now. So if you go out, if you go to the store, if you go to the post office, if you go, to get gas, like, no kidding, man. Wash your hands. You go to a bank machine. You tap a bank machine. Like, you have to wash your hands immediately, and do not touch your face. Okay? If you have some hand sanitizer, leave it in the car. As soon as you're in the car, wipe it down. Wipe down your steering wheel. Wipe down your gear shift. Wipe down your keys. You never know. I have one student who I think may have it. I'm not saying who it is. I just know that he's definitely better. But still, like, the numbers in Norwalk are really, really high. They're the highest, I think, in Connecticut. And it's shot up just this week. So do not kid yourself. Anybody can get it. The Prime Minister of England has it. Prince Charles has it. Anybody can get it. So just please stay safe as possible. And don't just think because you're 20 or 19 that, I can hang out with my friends, everything's cool. Do not. You have to stay home as much as possible, even though it's going to drive you crazy. Okay? All right, guys, be well.